Hello friends, welcome back my YouTube channel. If you want to watch the super hit movie Snow White and the Huntsman in full HD, then first of all give this video a like, and if you're visiting our channel for the first time, then subscribe to this channel. The name of the movie we are going to discuss in today's video is Snow White and the Huntsman. So we will give you information about how and where you will get to watch Snow White and the Huntsman film officially. Apart from this, we will give you a detailed look at the pre-production, post-production, budget, box office collection, and filming of this movie. A detailed review of the movie will also be given in this video, where we will explain the story of this movie in detail. We will also discuss the cast and casting performance of the movie. Apart from this, information about the music department and technical department will also be given. Because of this video is going to be very interesting and entertaining. So you must watch this video till the end. And if you haven't liked this video yet, then like this video now and subscribe to this channel. So let's start the video. Snow White and the Huntsman is a 2012 American dark fantasy action-adventure film directed by Rupert Sanders and written by Evan Doherty, John Lee Hancock, and Hossein Amini. Produced by Roth Films and distributed by Universal Pictures, the film is based on the Brothers Grimm's 1812 fairy tale, Snow White, and stars Kristen Stewart, Charlize Theron, Chris Hemsworth, and Sam Claflin. The plot follows Princess Snow White, who grows up imprisoned by her evil stepmother, the powerful sorceress Ravenna. After Snow White escapes into the forest, Ravenna enlists a huntsman named Eric to capture her, but he eventually becomes Snow White's companion in a quest to overthrow Ravenna and end her dark reign. Snow White and the Huntsman was theatrically released in the United Kingdom on May 30th, 2012, and in the United States on June 1st, 2012, by Universal Pictures. The film was a box office success, having grossed $396.6 million worldwide against a $170 million budget. Critics praised the production design and visual effects, and Theron's and Hemsworth's performances, as well as James Newton Howard's score, while the action sequences and Stewart's and Claflin's performances received mixed reviews. The film received 2 Oscar nominations for Best Visual Effects and Best Costume Design at the 85th Academy Awards. Stewart won Worst Actress at the 33rd Golden Raspberry Awards. A sequel, titled The Huntsman Winter's War, directed by the first film's visual effects supervisor, Cedric Nicholas Troyan, was released on April 22, 2016, with Hemsworth, Theron, Claflin, and Nick Frost reprising their roles. Plot: while admiring a bright red rose blooming during a white winter, Queen Eleanor of Tabor pricks her finger on its thorns. 3 drops of blood fall onto the snow, and she wishes for a daughter with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, hair as black as a raven's wings, and a heart as strong as the rose. The queen gives birth to Snow White, but falls ill and dies many years later. After her death, Snow White's father, King Magnus, and his army battle an invading army of glass soldiers. King Magnus finds a prisoner called Ravenna, becomes enchanted with her beauty, and marries her the next day. Ravenna is in fact a powerful sorceress who used the false glass army to charm her way into the kingdom. On their wedding night, she confesses that there was a king much like Magnus that used her, hurt her, then discarded her. She kills him before taking over the kingdom. Snow White's childhood friend William and his father, Duke Hammond, escape but are unable to rescue her, and she is locked away in a tower for years. Ravenna does not know why she allowed Snow White to live, but has a feeling about her. Tabor and its people deteriorate under Queen Ravenna's rule. She periodically drains the youth from the kingdom's young women in order to maintain a spell cast over her as a child by her mother, which allows Ravenna to keep her youthful beauty. When Snow White comes of age, Ravenna learns from her magic mirror that Snow White is destined to destroy her unless she consumes the girl's heart, which will make her immortal. Ravenna sends her brother Finn to bring her the princess, but Snow White escapes into the dark forest, where Ravenna has no power. The queen makes a bargain with Eric the Huntsman, a widower and drunkard, to capture her, promising to bring his wife back to life in exchange. However, when Finn reveals that Ravenna does not actually have the power to revive the dead, the Huntsman helps Snow White escape. The Duke and William learn that Snow White is alive, so William leaves the castle to find her, joining Finn's group as a bowman. Snow White saves the Huntsman's life by charming a troll that attacks them. They make their way to a fishing village populated by women who have disfigured themselves to make themselves useless to Ravenna. The Huntsman learns Snow White's true identity and leaves her in the care of the women. He quickly returns when he sees the village being burned down by Finn's men. Snow White and the Huntsman evade them and meet a band of 8 dwarfs. The blind dwarf, Muir, perceives that Snow White is the only person who can end Ravenna's reign. As they travel through a fairy sanctuary, they are attacked by Finn and his men. A battle ensues during which Finn, his men, and one of the dwarfs are killed. William joins the group on their journey to Hammond's castle. Ravenna disguises herself as William and tempts Snow White into eating a poisoned apple before fleeing. William kisses Snow White, though nothing happens. A single tear is shed from her eye. Snow White's body is taken to Hammond's castle. The huntsman professes his regret for being unable to save her, as her heart and strength remind him of his wife, Sarah. He kisses her, yet does not notice a second tear fall from her eyes, as 2 kisses of true love break the spell. Snow White awakens and rallies the Duke's army to mount a siege against Ravenna. The dwarfs infiltrate the castle through the sewers and open the gates, allowing the army inside. Snow White and Ravenna fight. When Ravenna is about to kill her, Snow White uses a move the huntsman taught her and stabs her to death in the heart. The kingdom once again enjoys peace as Snow White is crowned the new Queen of Tabor. Cast: Kristen Stewart as Snow White, the daughter of King Magnus and Queen Eleanor, and the stepdaughter of the evil queen Ravenna. Raffey Cassidy as young Snow White. Charlize Theron as Ravenna, Snow White's evil stepmother. Izzy Michael Small as young Ravenna. Chris Hemsworth as Eric the Huntsman, a widower and drunkard who helps Snow White escape Ravenna. Sam Claflin as William, son of Duke Hammond. Xavier Atkins as young William. Sam Spruill as Finn, Ravenna's younger brother and enforcer. Elliot Reeve as young Finn production. Development: Evan Doherty initially wrote the screenplay in 2003 when he was studying at NYU. At the time, gritty reboots of fairy tales were not a popular film genre, and according to Doherty, no one really knew what to do with it. More problems came when the release of Terry Gilliam's The Brothers Grimm, 2005, flopped at the box office, which caused potential buyers to be hesitant about the script. The script was finally greenlit after the success of Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, 2010. Casting: film producers considered casting a lesser-known actress for the role of Snow White, with mention of Riley Keough, Felicity Jones, Bella Heathcote, Alicia Vikander, Lily Collins, and Rachel Maxwell as possible picks. This idea became less likely as known actresses Dakota Fanning and Kristen Stewart were later rumored to be shortlisted for the role. On March 4, 2011, co-producer Palak Patel confirmed that Stewart was offered the role. Winona Ryder was initially considered to play Queen Ravenna before the role went to Charlize Theron. Tom Hardy was supposedly first offered the role of Eric, the Huntsman, but turned down the offer. The role was then apparently offered to Michael Fassbender and then Johnny Depp, but both claimed to have declined it. Viggo Mortensen was said to have been in negotiations with Universal for the part, but supposedly turned down the role, too. It was claimed that Hugh Jackman was offered the role, but that he declined. In 2011, Thor star Chris Hemsworth was eventually cast in the role of the Huntsman. Filming: principal photography took place in the United Kingdom. Most indoor scenes were shot at Pinewood Studios. The beach scenes were predominantly filmed in Pembrokeshire, Wales, on the Marlow Sands beach near the village of Marlows between September 26 and 29, 2011. Though the beach was not closed to the public during filming, as filming progressed, certain parts were advised to be off-limits. A computer-generated castle was set on nearby Gateholm Island. A field above the beach was used for production purposes, and a special wooden ramp was built for vehicles and horses to access the beach. Citation needed. Filming also took place at Frensham Small Pond. The film used academic consultants from the University of Chichester and the University of Oxford for backup research on fairy tales and medieval battles. Music. Main article, Snow White and the Huntsman. James Newton Howard composed the music for the film. The English band Florence and the Machine recorded Breath of Life exclusively for the film, which was reportedly inspired by Theron's character Queen Ravenna. Ioana Geeka of Io Echo performed Gone, a song that is played at Gus's funeral in the film. Release. The film had its premiere on May 14, 2012, at the Empire, Leicester Square in London. Citation needed. The film was released on DVD and Blu-ray in Region 1 on September 11, 2012, with both the theatrical version, 127 minutes, and an extended version, 132 minutes, available on both formats. The film was released on the same formats in Region 2 on October 1, 2012. A book based on the film was published June 5, 2012. Reception. Box office. Snow White and the Huntsman earned $155.3 million in North America, along with $241.3 million in other territories, for a worldwide total of $396.6 million. In North America, the film earned $1.38 million from midnight showings. For its opening day, the film topped the box office with $20.5 million. It debuted in first place at the box office during its opening weekend with $56.2 million. It is the 17th highest-grossing 2012 film. Outside North America, Snow White and the Huntsman had an opening of $39.3 million, ranking second overall for the weekend behind Men in Black 3. However, it ranked number 1 in 30 countries. Critical response. Snow White and the Huntsman received mixed reviews from critics. The film has a 49% score on Rotten Tomatoes based on 240 reviews, with an average rating of 5.6/10. The site's consensus states, while it offers an appropriately dark take on the fairy tale that inspired it, Snow White and the Huntsman is undone by uneven acting, problematic pacing, and a confused script. On Metacritic, the film has a score of 57 out of 100, based on 39 critics, indicating mixed or average reviews. CinemaScore polls conducted revealed the average grade that filmgoers gave the film was a B on an A+ to F scale. David Edelstein of New York praised the film's revisionist tone and said the film was strongly influenced by a lot of smart, feminist thinking. Roger Ebert gave the film 3.5 stars out of 4 and said, Snow White and the Huntsman reinvents the legendary story in a film of astonishing beauty and imagination. It's the last thing you would expect from a picture with this title. It falters in its storytelling, because Snow White must be entirely good, the Queen must be entirely bad, and there's no room for nuance. The end is therefore predetermined. But oh, what a ride! And concluded, there is a great film here somewhere, perhaps one that allowed greater complexity for the characters. But considering that I walked in expecting no complexity at all, let alone the visual wonderments, Snow White and the Huntsman is a considerable experience. A.O. Scott of the New York Times praised Theron's performance and also wrote, though it is an ambitious, at times mesmerizing application of the latest cinematic technology, the movie tries to recapture some of the menace of the stories that used to be told to scare children rather than console them. Owen Gleiberman of Entertainment Weekly wrote, Ravenna hates living in a world where men can feed on women's beauty and then toss them away. She's a fascist of feminism, and Theron's acting has the blood of operatic anger coursing through it. Betsy Sharkey of the Los Angeles Times said the film is an absolute wonder to watch and creates a warrior princess for the ages. But what this revisionist fairy tale does not give us is a passionate love. Its kisses are as chaste as the snow is white. Rolling Stone's Peter Travers called it a visual marvel, while noting that Stewart morphs convincingly from a skittish girl into a determined warrior princess. MSN News said that Stewart grows into her character, it seems, and eventually got this reviewer completely on her side. Colin Covert of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune gave the film 4/4 stars. Richard Roper of the Chicago Sun-Times gave the movie a B+, calling it vastly superior to Mirror, Mirror, and praising Theron and Stewart's performances. Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian said that while the film is less jokey than the recent Mirror, Mirror, this Twilightified fairy tale has the same basic problem, and that the result is tangled and overblown. Mick LaSalle of the San Francisco Chronicle called it slow, boring film that has no charm and is highlighted only by a handful of special effects and Charlize Theron's truly evil queen. Michael O'Sullivan of the Washington Post also gave the film a negative review. Overlong, overcrowded, overstimulating, and with an over-the-top performance by Charlize Theron as the evil Queen Ravenna, the movie is a virtual orchard of toxic excess, starting with the unnecessarily sprawling cast of characters. Lisa Kennedy of the Denver Post gave the film 2 out of 4 stars and said, "Only Bob Hoskins as the blind seer Muir comes close to making us care. We can almost glean Snow White's heroic possibilities through his clouded eyes. As much as we'd like to, we certainly can't from Stewart's efforts." Film comments Scott Foundas states that Stewart's Snow White pouts her lips, bats her bedroom eyes, and scarcely seems to have more on her mind than who might take her to the senior prom, let alone the destiny of an entire kingdom. Sequel. Main article, The Huntsman Winter's War. A sequel was planned, with director Rupert Sanders in talks to return. In August 2012, The Hollywood Reporter reported that the sequel was shelved in the aftermath of the scandal involving Sanders cheating on his wife with Stewart, and that a spin-off film concentrating on the Huntsman was planned instead, which would not star Stewart. Universal announced a few days later that they were not shelving the sequel. A 2012 report stated that Universal has authorized a sequel, and Stewart was set to reprise her role, but without Sanders to return as the director, due to the scandal. The script was written and production was set to begin in 2013. The film was originally scheduled for release in 2015. In September 2013, Chris Hemsworth stated he did not know anything about the sequel while speaking to E! On June 4, 2014, Deadline reported that Frank Darabont, Gavin O'Connor, and Andres Muschietti were on the shortlist to direct the sequel. On June 26, 2014, Deadline reported that Darabont was in talks to direct the sequel. Originally, Legendary Pictures was set to co-finance the film with Universal, but dropped out and were replaced by Perfect World Pictures. On July 31, 2014, the project was described as a prequel titled The Huntsman, scheduled for April 22, 2016, which would not star Stewart as Snow White. In January 2015, Darabont left the project as director, but the third leading role was set with Emily Blunt. It was later announced that Cedric Nicholas Troyan would take over as the new director for the film. Nick Frost would return as Dwarf Nyan, and Jessica Chastain would star. On March 18, 2015, Rob Brydon, Alexandra Roach, and Sheridan Smith were added to the cast as dwarves. The Wrap confirmed on May 7, 2015, that Sam Claflin would return as William in this sequel. It was later revealed that the film would feature Ravenna's sister, the Ice Queen, and would reveal the origins of the Huntsman while also continuing the story of the first film. The film, which is both a prequel and a sequel, was released in 2016 as The Huntsman Winter's War. Snow White and the Huntsman reinvents the legendary story in a film of astonishing beauty and imagination. It's the last thing you would expect from a picture with this title. It falters in its storytelling because Snow White must be entirely good, the Queen must be entirely bad, and there's no room for nuance. The end is therefore predetermined. But oh, what a ride. This is an older Snow White than we usually think of. Played for most of the film by Kristen Stewart, capable and plucky, she has spent long years locked in a room of her late father's castle, imprisoned by his cruel second wife, Charlize Theron. When she escapes and sets about righting wrongs, she is a mature young woman of interest to the two young men who join in her mission. But the movie sidesteps scenes of romance, and in a way, I suppose that's wise. The Huntsman, Chris Hemsworth, is a heroic, mead-guzzling hunter assigned by the Queen to track down Snow White and bring her back to the castle. After encountering her, however, he is so impressed he changes sides. There is also Prince William, Sam Claflin, smitten since childhood, and the two men join in an unstated alliance. The Queen lives in terror of losing the beauty of her youth and constantly tops up with the blood of virgins to restore it. She tests her success with the proverbial mirror on the wall, which melts into molten metal and assumes a spectral form, not unlike death in The Seventh Seal, although its metallic transformation process reminds us of the Terminator. The castle, which sits in eerie splendor on an island joined to the mainland only at low tide, is a gothic fantasy that reminds me of the Gormenghast series. The queen is joined there by her brother, somewhat diminished by his blonde pageboy haircut, who does her bidding but seems rather out to lunch. Extras appear when needed, then disappear. The queen commands extraordinary supernatural powers, including the ability to materialize countless black birds that can morph into fighting demons or shards of cutting metal. All of this is rendered appropriately by the special effects, but the treasure of this film is in two of its locations: a harsh, forbidding dark forest and an enchanted fairyland. Both of these realms exist near the castle, and the Huntsman is enlisted in the first place because he knows the dark forest where Snow White has taken refuge. In this forbidding realm, nothing lives, and it is thick with the blackened bones of dead trees, as if a forest fire had burned only the greenery. There is no cheer here, and a monstrous troll confronts Snow White in a dramatic stare-down. After the Huntsman frees her from the dark forest, they are delighted to find, or be found by, the 8 dwarves. Yes, 8, although one doesn't survive, reducing their number to the proverbial 7. These characters look strangely familiar, and no wonder. The magic of CGI has provided the faces of familiar British actors such as Ian McShane, Bob Hoskins, Ray Winstone, Nick Frost, Eddie Marsan, and Toby Jones. While this technique is effective, it nevertheless deprives 8 working, real dwarves with jobs, which isn't really fair. The dwarves lead them to my favorite realm in the film, an enchanting fairyland, which is a triumph of art direction and CGI. Mushrooms open their eyes and regard the visitors. Cute forest animals scamper and gambol in tribute to a forest scene in Disney's 1937 animated film. The fairies themselves are naked, pale-skinned sprites with old, wise faces. The spirit of this forest is embodied by a great white stag with expressive eyes and horns that spread in awesome complexity. This is a wonderful scene. The director, Rupert Sanders, who began in TV commercials, is clearly familiar with establishing memorable places. As for the rest, there is a sufficiency of medieval battle scenes, too many for my taste, and a fairly exciting siege of the castle, aided by the intervention of the dwarves, and featuring catapults that hurl globes of burning tar. Always enjoyable. There is a great film here somewhere, perhaps one that allowed greater complexity for the characters. But considering that I walked in expecting no complexity at all, let alone the visual wonderments, Snow White and the Huntsman is a considerable experience. In this new version of the fairy tale, the second in just a few months, Snow White is like a cross between Aslan and Joan of Arc. It's very different from the jokiness of Julia Roberts' Mirror Mirror, but with a similar basic problem. Kristen Stewart stars as the heroine. Charlize Theron is the sexy evil queen with headgear modeled on the Disney animation, and Chris Hemsworth plays the Huntsman, who is now a full-blown romantic lead, a hunky, stubbly protector with an accent like Russell Crowe's Robin Hood, from Cowdenbeath, Taunton, and Dublin. In the manner of Twilight and Hunger Games, the film gives Snow White an unresolved and franchise-friendly romantic choice between the Huntsman and a posh prince resonantly named William, Sam Claflin. Unlike Julia Roberts' feebly evasive version, this movie does at least tackle head-on the Queen's sexual jealousy, and Theron has an interesting steely coldness at first, but she is soon reduced to screeching like a panto villainess in that all-purpose bard-speak accent. Her stepdaughter leads a revolution against the Queen's misrule, and Snow White has the power to cure the people's physical ailments. Like Mirror Mirror, the dwarves are badass forest brigands played by British character actors, but with a Narnia touch. It all becomes very drawn out, and like Mirror Mirror, tries to fix what isn't broken. The poignant clarity of Snow White being betrayed by a non-mother and then having to be a quasi-mother to 7 little people. That is evidently far too babyish and needs to be sexed up, or rather teen abstinenced up. The result is tangled and overblown. She is soon reduced to screeching like a panto villainess in that all-purpose bake accent. Her stepdaughter leads a revolution against the queen's misrule, and Snow White has the power to cure the people's physical ailments. Like Mirror Mirror, the dwarves are badass forest brigands, played by British character actors. But with a Narnia touch, it all becomes very drawn out, and like Mirror Mirror tries to fix what isn't broken. The poignant and clarity of Snow White being betrayed by a non-mother and then having to be a quasi-mother to 7 little people that is evidently far too babyish and needs to be sexed up, or rather teen. Abstinence up. The result is tangled and overblown. Once Upon a Time isn't enough. Once it would seem restricts your potential audience far, far too much. Teen girls weed on Twilight are valuable, but if you only tell Snow's Kristen Stewart story, how will you draw in their boyfriends and brothers? Make sure a Prince Charming, actually Sam Claflin's mini Duke William, is handy with a bow, and get Thor, Chris Hemsworth, to trade his hammer for a whopping great chopper. But what about the older female audience? Throw some weight and a little sympathy into the story of the wrinkled, dreading, evil queen, Charlize, Theron, and their husbands. Recast the dwarves as pugnacious inebriate. Should more expect to find slumped and patty power than cheerfully toiling down a diamond wine. While eye-catching and impressively middle ear, this latest take on the grim fairy tale closely following Tarsum Singh's Daffy Candy Cane Mirror Mirror doesn't so much aim high as aim broad, and it is at the cost of good old-fashioned storytelling. Snow White the Huntsman lacks strength of perspective and suffers an excess of superfluous characters. There's a clue in the fact that this is the take with 8 dwarves. The juggling of typically indulged in sequels, but this gets straight to it. Few earned their right to be here, as they did, say, in Avengers Assemble. The dwarves are so underwritten, it's hard to make a case for even their presence in this version of Grimm's tale. Given Hemsworth's moody, grimy, and needlessly Scottish accented huntsman already has their job with added rugged sexiness too, although that doesn't mean you won't wish for more dwarf action. Smart casting compensates, and it is a pleasure to see the likes of Ian McShane, Nick Frost, Toby Jones, and Ray Winstone playing Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits playing the A7 dwarves. Unsurprisingly, they supply the majority of lighter moments. We're promised gold. And what do we get? Boom. Whines Frost's Big Nan as the crew wade through a sewer. That looks like one of mine. Grunts Winston Court from under his bleached Mr. T hairdo. You get the idea. Another casting coup is the as Ravenna, like an icy Hitchcock blonde, seeking widespread payback for all the indignities once inflicted upon her. Theron makes the queen a force of coiled cold fury with an enforced almost reptilian economy of movement. This is convincing bodied language for a woman who knows she is long past her best before date. Even her vocal register feels a little too old, a little too low, a little too slowed. It's absorbingly creepy, right down to the insinuation that all this A Man in the Mirror business, with its showy, flowy VFX, is just a fabrication of her own parchment fragile mind. It's a shame we can't lavish such praise on her pure-hearted nemesis. Not that Kristen Stewart is inherently bad as Snow, just that she needs to be directed away from all those little tics which 5 or 6 spouts of Bella have ingrained in her. Stewart won't stop doing that thing where she looks like she's just tasted something unpleasant, then smiles like it hurts a little bit. It's as if Snow White spends a whole movie having just taken a bite of that poisoned apple. It's perhaps one symptom of the fact that this ambitious picture is carried in on the shoulders of a first-timer, Rupert Sanders. Yet his commercials background revealed a budding visual style which blooms impressively in this vast landscape. Guillermo del Toro, and especially that other one-time ad Ridley Scott, are evident inspirations. Sanders even stages his climactic beach battle just an hour's drive north of the extremely similar one in Scott's Robin Hood. There are deft touches, though. Snow White's flight into the hate black and dark forest stands out with the fugitive princess inhaling fungal spores and suffering the bad trip of a lifetime. The forest floor becomes a carpet of dead sunbirds. Shadowy forms lurch from the gloam. A batwing demon screeches down from the malformed canopy. Later, in one virtuoso flourish, we see a depleted Ravenna flailing on the ground, having just metamorphosed back into human form from that of a flock of crows, her black feathered mantle and cloak now a glistening oil slick, her Avon cuts flailing desperately like seabirds in an X and death bath. So for all its flaws, this remains a promising debut. We would like to see what Sanders can do next. Although judging by all that dangling, likely be Snow White the Huntsman too, because clearly Once Upon a Time is never enough. I wouldn't have thought of myself ever really checking out this movie out of self-ambition. However, I came across a video review of it from a usually trusted source, so I gave it an honest chance, and to my pleasant surprise, I do indeed enjoy this movie a great deal. There are two main reasons why I write reviews. The first is because I love film in many of its forms, and I enjoy sharing my passions for it. The second is to open up others to films that I feel are worth discovering. And in turn, I enjoy other people opening up my horizons to new good films. So, it's great when others do the same for me. With the Snow White the Huntsman, there's a really solid fantasy picture here worth giving a chance to. Years ago, the noble King Magnus fell prey to the enchantment of the evil Ravenna, Charlize Theron, who killed him and took reign over his kingdom. Sustained by draining the life from others. Queen Ravenna remains forever young and beautiful. But the king's daughter, left alive and imprisoned, has now come of age as the fairest of all in the land to threaten this darkness. A Snow White. Kristen Stewart soon escapes the castle, and the queen sends a rugged huntsman, Chris Hemsworth, to track her down. However, the huntsman soon joins with Snow White on a journey to see her father's kingdom reclaimed through a land of treacherous enemies. While watching this, I was really pleased that it kept selling me on it all the way through. I like the narration by the huntsman, who gracefully sets up the details of this story, taking us through Snow White's youth and the kingdom's fall. The movie is tightly paced, propelling its story forward in only matter, but still with plenty of meat to the characters. While writing this review, the film seemed to move along even faster than on my first viewing of the theatrical cut. The extended version has a few good new scenes that add a little extra depth and detail here and there. There is a scene between the huntsman and William Snow White's childhood friend and archer. In the extended cut, that better sets up and pays off another scene with the obligatory poison apple. Of course, we also get some very good action sequences, which are also tight and to the point. They exist long enough to serve their purpose and are solidly satisfying and exciting. But it all feels real and consequential. The battles are never taken lightly, and there are casualties beyond just the obligatory background soldiers. Now, really looking at this, I feel this is a fantasy film that could have hit in the 1980s. Next to a Highlander or Excalibur, this movie has some stunning imagery and inspired cinematography. Early on, I love how bold the blood reds are. They stand out as really symbolic. Overall, this film has grit, murkiness, and dramatic weight. And many scenes are smoky and moody. And creates a tangible, grounded world that still allows for the fantastical to live and breathe. It's a dark world reflecting the grim bleakness the queen has cast over it, and that just creates a very engaging look for me. It has a lot of that same texture found in The Lord of the Rings, the movies, but with more of its own gritty, mystical atmosphere and mood. Snow White and the Huntsman is a really beautifully shot film, helmed by a director who clearly has vision. Surely, for some, Kristen Stewart would be an obstacle for them due to her work in theatre to movies. I have not subjected myself to those films for many reasons, but I believe this film shows that sometimes it's not the actor but the material that should be questioned. I am very pleased to state that Kristen Stewart is a very wonderful job here. It did not take me long to see that she was a young woman of admirable talent. There's a lot of depth to this character, and there's a strong arc for her that Kristen Stewart conveys remarkably well. The fear is something she sells very realistically early on, but there is a hope and strength that grows out of that fear. As Snow White progresses through this adventure, you see her mature into a stronger, more active character. There is subtlety and beauty to what Stewart accomplishes here. She really shows a lot of heart, warmth, but also a tinge of sorrow along the way. And indeed, she has touching chemistry with Chris Hemsworth, which also really drives this film forward on many great levels. I am really a believer that Chris Hemsworth is on the verge of having an amazing career. While my exposure to him has been very minimal outside of Thor, he continues to demonstrate a powerful presence and great depth of talent in net. Physicality here greatly. The Huntsman surely has his humor stemming from his attitude and Hemsworth's rich charisma. Yet, there is a heartbreak to him stemming from being a widower, and Hemsworth really digs deep inside to evoke those potentially tear-jerking emotions. It's a very dimensional character, backed by a performance that quickly and easily enders himself to an audience. Off thing comes from his accent, which I couldn't place, but turns out it was supposed to be Scottish. In the least, he puts forth more effort into his accent than Sean Connery has with any other accent in his entire career. Charlize Theron is perfectly cast as the evil queen, Ravenna. She plays it as someone on the fray ends of manic obsession. Ravenna is insanely consumed with her outward beauty, but surely inside, she is a horrible monster. Theron has more than proven her talent over the years, and this is an absolutely excellent performances. There is a tragic quality to this twisted character, and you see that soaked into every fiber of the performance. Taylor's complexity and depth to her that runs very deep. An unflinching stir is downright scary. You can see just how far off the deep end she is between that and her explosive rants. The even tore a stomach muscle because she was screaming so intensely, and I can relieve it, and there are still dwarves in this tale. These roles are filled by great actors such as Bob Hoskins, Ian McShane, and Ray Winstone, among others. The same sort of techniques used for similar smaller-statured characters in the Lord of the Rings of films were used here and done so with seamless results. Hoskins is essentially their leader and has the most dialogue. However, while his line deliveries are quite good, I found it odd that he was practically stone-faced throughout. I don't think he registered a single actual facial expression in his screen time. Regardless, the dwarves tend to add the needed levity to the heavier, dramatic story being told. But they never make things silly, just a little fun and light-hearted at times in the latter half of the movie. I would say that the only segment of the film that didn't wholly appeal to me was the latter half of the fairy sanctuary. Tatis is the land that has been untouched by Ravenna's darkness, and it is flourishing with a lush landscape and fantastical wonders. However, there's just a lot of peculiar CGI woodland creatures that simply weren't to my liking. With so much gritty realism in the film, this just felt pushed too deeply into the vibrant, slightly cartoonish fantastical realm. But it's not long before it shifts back into the dark grittiness. This does bring up the issue of the digital effects. Most are really good, especially in the dark forest with all the almost pitch-black creatures that slither and crawl out of the darkness. But in this fairy sanctuary, it is very obvious CGI and feels like it came out of another film. That's another reason why that sequence didn't work too well. For me, also the Withering Age makeup on Charlize therein is especially good, but some of the more elaborate morphing effects shots on her have room for improvement. Generally, the digital effects are fairly good with some really good stuff, but there is some more prominently on display work that doesn't come off all that well. Thankfully, this film has very practical stunt work, and the realistic locations like the castles were actually built for the film. The filmmakers didn't rely on digital map paintings. This film, while taking a new approach to the material, still hits all the classic beats of the Snow White story, but uses them to propel the story into larger territory. The poison apple from Ravenna to Snow White gives Hemsworth his best scene pouring out his heart over the dead Snow White. When she returns from death, it inspires and motivates herself and everyone else to take up arms and charge into battle. Kristen Stewart delivers a strong, inspirational rallying speech to these people. The fire and passion she projects is great. Is the moment where the character comes into her own and becomes a leader to take back the kingdom that was stolen from her father. A Snow White and the Huntsman still has that fairy tale simplicity, but adds insignificant depth to mature the content, which is what makes it work so well. Not every character has their sense of realism and dimensionality, and they serve both the gritty realism and the fantastical elements of the movie. This film's exciting, entertaining, it has a good, solid story, fine substance, satisfying character arcs, and overall just has a great look to it. Also from the opening logos to the end credits, the score is just enveloping and moody. That comes as no surprise from James Newton Howard, one of the best film score composers around today. Directed Rupert Sanders simply does a very solid job with this material and hons his actors into bringing this darker fantasy take to life. I would say this is a hell of a good feature film directorial debut, and I hope he continues to deliver this kind of tight, cohesive quality. Tate, I know a sequel has already been planned, and while there's not much precedent for further Snow White adventures, I will be eagerly interested to see what story these filmmakers can see for it. There's a great set of characters here that were well developed and filled by strong, rich talents. So there is potential there, but until then, I will be happy to revisit this adventure quite a few times. But there are a few twists to this fairy tale made famous by the animated Disney film in the late 1930s. The huntsman Chris Hemsworth essentially takes the place of the prince in this movie. He is a widower who at first is given the assignment to capture Snow White, Kristen Stewart, but instead his heart is captured by the virtuous and beautiful princess. And this is definitely a darker version of the story. There are many sword fights in the film, although they are very well done. The dwarves are sword fighters in this one. You won't find Dopey or Doc or Grumpy in this small movie. Despite the well-choreographed sword fights, it is mainly within the action of these fights that the violence level rates a 3 in our content rating, disqualifying it from receiving our Dove family-approved seal. It certainly didn't help when the Queen Charlize Theron took a bloody heart from a bird and ate it. To her credit, Theron plays the Queen as icy, cold, and evil, a woman who takes the youth of young women in order to sustain her youthful lulling look. Although the blood isn't seen throughout the film, there are almost non-stop fights or moments of violence, which include many characters receiving arrows to the back and dying. So despite the themes of true love's kiss, winning over death and good triumphing over evil, plus purity and innocence being early on by Snow White, it's too bad the dark mood and consistent violence knocks it out of our family-approved arena. A bold rethinking of a familiar old story and striking design elements are undercut by a draggy midsection and undeveloped characters in A Snow White and the Huntsman. After the Compy family Pharaoh fam Mirror Mirror, this second revisionist take of the year on the 19th century fairy tale strides out deadly serious and in full armor. Not to mention with more costume changes for a Charizona than a Lady Gaga concert. Designed to appeal to teen and young adult girls and guys, this muscular PG-13 action-adventure conspicuously lacks romance, but should get a good box office ride on the shoulders of Kristen Stewart and a Chris Hemsworth. The teeing up is dramatic to say the least, giving a swift and dire account of the malevolent usurpation of the throne of a rugged waterfront kingdom by Raffey Cassidy, a stunning blonde who infiltrates from enemy territory, bewitches the widowed monarch, and dispatches him on their wedding night. The king's daughter is kept prisoner in a high tower until her maturity, at which point the queen's mirror, in this case a giant golden plate that morphs into a molten statue, informs her that the status of fairest in the land has shifted to Snow White Stewart, who represents the queen's greatest threat as well as her salvation. All through this, the visual elements are riveting, with production designer Dominic Watson and costume designer Kenneth Wood making major statements with their fabulously detailed and rich-looking creations. Initially basked on blacks, whites, and reds, the color scheme is slowly expanded to embrace a rich, carefully calculated array of hues, which first-time director Rupert Sanders, whose background is in commercials, knows how to show off to maximum effect. Won't be to anyone who would permit Snow White to escape. But since the guilty party is the Queen's albinoish enforcer brother, Finn Sam's Brule, this unfortunate fellow is merely obliged to follow her into the aptly named Dark Forest, to which she has perilously fled, and from which the dirty, unschooled teenager can only be rescued by a drunken warrior Hemsworth. Another, widower who has nothing to lose. Sanders shows a skilled hand for conjuring up dramatic contexts, presenting characters, making actors look good, and stirring up threatening moods. He's less effective at maintaining interest over the long haul of the midsection's lengthy journey. As the Huntsman leads Snow White through the dreaded forest to a village of women and children and onto a land known as Sanctuary, a once enchanted home to dwarfs, sprites on unique animals that has come upon hard times since the evil queen has been in power. Although this interlude has its charms, stemming from the creature creations, as well as the stain, from the lightly amusing characterizations of the little guys by normally robust actors such as McShane, Bob Hoskins, Ray Winstonia, and Eddie Marsan. The protracted Addis feels especially flat because it's not marked by any deepening of the personalities of the princess and her blade-toting escort, or any significant alterations in their relationship. Hemsworth's soldier seems too loaded and hung up on his late wife to think too seriously about Snow White. But even if he did, he'd have to defer to William Sam Claflin, the princess's childhood friend and presumed intended, who turns up with the season's light, obligatory weapon, the bow and arrow, to join the good fight and install Snow White on her throne back home where she belongs. Every so often, the film cuts back to the castle to reveal the queen in distressed states of aging and miraculous rejuvenation, the latter alarmingly achieved by sucking the youth out of younger victims. This royal would seem to be a self-made vampire of sorts, as well as a forerunner of contemporary youth-obsessed women willing to do almost anything to maintain their beauty and allure. So this is a film of moments, overesting visuals, marked seriousness, sometimes surprising imagination, and with nothing on its mind, really, except to provide the conventional reassurance of installing a rightful royal on the throne. It's also a film in which you can't help but behold and compare the contrasting beauty of two of the most exceptional-looking women on the screen today. Stewart and the Sanders studies both of them closely, and from many angles, with Stewart nearly always maintaining terrial air clenched by determination and the expressing a will and mercilessness to rival any desperate despite the narrow ranges their roles require. Both command one's attention throughout, required in their own ways to be gaze-worthy. Hemsworth and Claflin bear up in far more constricted parts. The scenery is gorgeous. Charlize there. Owen looks great in close-up, and her costumes are spectacular. The special effect of turning all those British character actors into dwarfs is impressive. Did I mention the scenery is gorgeous? Yeah, I think I've said all the nice things I can think of concerning Snow White and the Huntsman. Despite all its chainmail and shimmering swords, the first 2 or 3 is the same basic Snow White story you might already know, just a little more extreme only. No, it isn't extreme, it's faux extreme. Dark, yes, but bloodless, bland, and clearly born from a boardroom looking to capitalize on all the fantasy crap the kids like these days. By some twist of fate, the dullest of all possible humans, Kristen Stewart has a high AQ rating, and due to her involvement in the dreadful Twilight films, so from a strictly banking perspective, it makes perfect sense to cast her as a heroine of this tale. The trouble is that she has all the flavor of dried celery. She is meant to represent pure life. Ian McShane actually calls her the one with an ear Navi-like connection to 10 feet tall Luck and other critters. She's also Joan of Arc, suiting up in armor and charging on, since her prepubescent years knows how to sword fight isn't explained. If I didn't jot this down in my notebook, I may have forgotten this little dip in logic. Not because the climax to Snow White and the Huntsman is so riveting it negates all quibbles, but because there are so many dumb parts, it is impossible to remember them all. Here's one worthy of some scorn. The Queen Charlize Theron forces the huntsman Christo Hemsworth to go find Snow White in the dark forest. No way, he's going there, it's so dangerous. If he won't go, she'll kill him, she says. Us. When he gets back, she'll resurrect his dead wife. She's got powers, despite bitching and moaning that entering the dark forest is a death sentence. He leads the Queen's brother and others to Snow White and the amount of time it takes an editor to cut. But Snow White argues the Queen will betray you, and the Queen's brother basically says, yeah, and she's right. She can't bring your wife back. Why the hell would he say that? He can't just say she's nuts and change the topic. They know the Huntsman is a badass. That's why they hired him. There's plenty more. Like when Snow White is in desperate need of a horse for a minute, then a horse appears but then disappears when she doesn't need it anymore. Or when Thor's accent moves from English to Scottish to some sort of Sylvester Stallone, or the sole attempt at humor, a smelly poo joke, or the face-morphing CGI that looks like someone left in the previous software, making this the worst bit of big-budget special effects since the sank destruction in X-Men Origins Wolverine. Basically, this is a movie designed to watch Mystery Science Theater style. Lord knows you've got to say something to break the tension when Charlize the AC is writhing around on the floor whimpering poor Charlize. She like Julia Roberts Cena, the vastly superior Mirror, or super depraved like Lena Headey Cersei in Game of Thrones. I get the impression that the production may have been buttoned up on the outstanding crowns she wears, but the character's tone was never locked down. The blame for all this rests on the screenwriters, one of Vev, whom is the always awful John Lee Hancock, and the director, newcomer Rupert Sanders. The characters are given nothing unique to say or do, and Sanders has no clue how to take lemons and make lemonade. There are two opportunities where Kristen Stewart and Thor are supposed to share a moment. I wouldn't be surprised if the screenplay just said, "Insert emotional connection here." Details TK Sanders takes this and runs with it, by having his leads stare at one another. That's it. That's what's next. Supposed to set 13-year-old girls' hearts aflame and prove the executives that greenlit this disaster were right. Instead, it's a laugh riot. Let's start out by not dwelling over much on the existence of Mirror. The basic story outline may be the same, but the similarities and their everything of importance is different: tone, intent, plot, specifics, and so forth. A Mirror is a family film with occasional bursts of Fat Time Bandits-inspired comedy. A Snow White and the Huntsman is a darker, more serious endeavor, a fantasy-tinged action-adventure tragedy that may disappoint traditionalists expecting something more child-friendly. The participation of Kristen Stewart will from the passive, chronically victimized Bella Swan. Imagine, if you will, Bella dressed in armor and swinging a sword. There's something almost Shakespearean about this movie. The three leads are emotionally damaged and spend a great deal of time trying to work through some issues. All could use a weekly therapy session, but they find ways to compensate at times. Ace Snow White and the Huntsman is almost too grim for how its own good. It's not a lot of fun, and the heroic element rounds in the lean atmosphere. Attempts to inject a little humor via the antics of the dwarves don't work, especially since one of the little people is killed early in the proceedings. No one's going to be singing hi-ho, hi-ho. It's off to work we go. After that happens, Snow White and the Huntsman includes plenty of PG-13 violence, with creatures that would be at home, either the Lord of the Rings, the Chronicles of Narnia, or a Harry Potter. The larger battle sequences, of which there are several, are perfunctory, suffering by comparison with the long, gritty, detailed conflicts presented in Peter Jackson's films. Visually, however, A Snow White and the Huntsman is splendid, arguably offering a more eye-popping experience than the fantastical world created by Tarzan in A Mirror. First-time director Rupert Sanders treats his cinematic canvas like a grand playground, allowing his imagination to run free with the aid of CGI. An evocative sequence in which a flock of crows comes together to form the Queen is emblematic of Sanders' visual sense. Whether or not he can direct actors with equal expertise remains an open question. A Snow White and the Huntsman does not provide sufficient evidence to assign a grade. The story follows a trajectory that is generally familiar. Snow White, Kristen Stewart, grows up an orphan under the thumb of the cruel, beautiful Queen Ravla, Charlize Theron, who married Snow's father, then killed him on their wedding night. Snow is kept prisoner in the castle's north tower, while Rava terrorizes her subjects. When an opportunity to escape presents itself, Snow seizes it, fleeing into the dark forest. There, she meets the huntsman Chris Hemsworth, carrying an axe instead of a hammer, who agrees for a price to convey her to the estate of the rebel duke who is sheltering refugees from Rab's purges. Along the way, they encounter a troll, fairies, a band of dwarves, initially numbering 8, and a white hart, while being pursued by the queen's brother, Finn Sam's Brule, and his elite Corb. By the way, the Rava-Finn relationship may call to mind that of siblings Cersei and Jaime in a Game of Thrones. A sexual liaison is not explicitly revealed. To do so would result in an automatic R from the pay, but it is hinted that the film's most strident performance belongs to Charlize Theron, who emphasizes Rala's evil by shouting every line of dialogue. A traumatic childhood and reliance upon soul-sucking magic have leached all humanity from the queen, her inevitable, and will make the castle a quieter place. He is fine in scenes when she has no lines, such as one in which the queen disrobes and immerses herself in what looks like a milk bath, but when speaking, she's often too over the top to convey true menace. Chris Hemsworth offers a low-key portrayal as a titular huntsman, allowing the tragedy that haunts the character to inform his every action and decision. It's a nice, understated piece of acting. Unfortunately, Kristen Stewart, perhaps still experiencing a thespian hangover from spending so much time appearing in, at least, interesting character, unless you count her potential love interest. William, Sam Claflin. The dwarves are played by normal-sized actors like Ian McShane, Bob Hoskins, and Ray Winstone, who have been miniaturized by special effects. Snow White and the Huntsman's romance appears to have been modeled after the Luke, Han, Lele love triangle, with Snow torn between the mercenary huntsman, whose reasons for helping her change from monetary to personal over the course of the film, and the heroic, good-hearted, and boring William. It becomes obvious who the winner is when we see whose kiss awakens her from the poison apple spell. The love story is kept in the background and is not used as a hook to attract would-be female viewers. Expectations for Snow White and the Huntsmona determine its reception. The movie, with its ominous subjects and dark, stylish execution, may prove to be unpalatable to those who crave lighter fare. Then again, Chris Nolan's Batman movies have not been hampered by a bleak tone. As far as live-action reimaginings of fairy 2011's A Red Riding Hood is fire. And for those who think A Snow White and the Huntsman mana is too scary for young kids, they're right. But they're not called the Brother Sigma for nothing. I've always had a soft spot for Snow White. She was the only fairy tale princess I'd heard of who wasn't blonde. And the Disney cartoon was the first movie I ever saw as a child. I was entranced. I have taken all my fashion cues from her since then. Black-haired beauties with white skin and red lips, Liz Taylor, Vivian Leigh, even Maleficent in all her arch darkness. I must have 50 tubes of varying shades of red lipstick. Refused all suggestions to lighten my hair as I've gotten older and never get sun on my face. I love vampires, so I couldn't wait to see Snow White and the Huntsman and Kristen Stewart as Snow. A Stewart, while not a great beauty, has a dark, mysterious, turbulent quality that I thought would serve. And with the right lighting and makeup, she could be devastating. Not quite. It's Charlize Theron as the wicked stepmother, Revena, whose a beauty resonates here. In fact, beauty is her own Tory and the source of her fury. She has been victimized by her beauty and the men who have loved her and would leave her unless she remains beautiful. Ow, she's got a point. Thus, she has been taking her revenge on generations of lovers ever since. Dada Ravenna makes sense. She's fighting for her life, and gloriously terrifying as she orders the huntsman Chris Hemsworth to bring her Snow White's heart beating with blood. Hannibal Lecter's got nothing on her. Stuart Snow has her hands full holding her own and needs every bit of weaponry at her disposal to do it. Dada somehow clad in pants beneath her gown. Snow wields a sword after one brief lesson from the grumpy huntsman. But it's her innate goodness of her inner beauty as she stares down at all. That is her secret weapon. Stewart doesn't quite convey that purity or conviction. her goodness is not nearly as radiant as Theron's wickedness. It throws the film off, and I wish the director Rupert Sanders, a maker of commercials and video games, were a better race storyteller. Individual images look slick and beautiful of the dark forest, the wild sea, but 8 individual scenes lack shape and strung together don't accumulate real dramatic power. A Snow's romantic, a leanings, remain untapped and unclaw. Even at the end, where the filmmaker simply lets the camera hang flaccidly on a wide shot with nar tension, resolving dramatic conclusion in sight. If you are expecting a Disney-esque reimagining of a beloved fairy tale with a Snow White and a Huntsman, you have either missed the movie trailer on television or have succumbed to wishful thinking. This movie journeys quite far from the sanitized animated classic from a bygone era. Such Snow White staples as a mirror, Mirror on the Wall, and the 7 Dwarfs play central roles. Xena, Snow White, and the Huntsman, a but sleepy, dopey, and Doc, have been replaced by the fiercer but likable Beth, Muir, and Gort. First-time director Rupert Sanders, best known for his work on television commercials, certainly has done a remarkable job of creating a dark medieval world filled with scurvy peasants, mock and mire, and odd-looking creatures that scurry about. As highly stylized visuals are the hallmark of this film. In a classic tale of good versus evil, an evil temptress, Charlize Theron, a Hancock, captivates a grieving king who has recently lost his wife. On their wedding night, she kills him to white, Kristen Stewart, 8. The queen locks the young heroine in a prison-like dark tower in hopes that she will live a tortured existence. A Snow White eventually escapes into the dark forest. The queen chooses a down on his luck-grieving widower Huntsman, Eric Chris Hemsworth, a Thor the Avengers, to capture Snow White and bring her back. Furthermore, Snow White's childhood friend, William Sam Claflin, a Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tide Desa, also sets out to find and save her from the queen. Stewart, a favorite of fantasy genre fans from her role in the At Waitita series, struggles to capture the innocence and inner strength that Snow White possesses. Limited in range as an actor, Stewart certainly embodies a fighting spirit, but seems to be lacking in the ethereal department, a key component of the Snow White character. Despite a tendency to overact in some scenes, Theron gives a bailing, multi-layered performance that reveals the pure evil of the queen character, but also demonstrates a vulnerability in her insatiable desire to be beautiful. You can't fault a movie where good overcomes evil when the fate of the world seems to be teetering to war on. Sanders does a commendable job of drawing a clear line between darkness and light. People of faith will be pleased to hear Snow White recite the Lord's Prayer. Matthew 6:9-13a. When all hope seems lost, while she is locked away in the dark tower, she is delivered from her prison of woe shortly thereafter. The likable but gruff band of dwarves led by Ian McShane, Bob Hoskins, and Ray Winstone provide much-needed optimism in a time of dread. While their humor is limited, the dwarves more than make up for it in spirit and a willingness to help despite the rather dismal circumstances. Christian viewers will be highly disappointed over the heavy-handed use of sorcery, black magic, and various spells cast by the evil queen. While it is certainly understood that the evil queen uses magic in the original fairy tale, viewers are subjected to a much darker, semi-er use of it in this movie. While coarse language is limited, there are many intense sequences of violence that should make parents take pause. In addition, there are several scenes of brief sensuality involving the evil queen. For all of its spectacular visual imagery and special effects, A Snow White and the Huntsman fall short in one highly critical area. Please note this movie does succeed on many levels. As cinematically, it is well crafted. It is visually appealing. Theron is very good in her portrayal of a tragic figure. However, as a Christian, I can't look beyond the text, sorcery and black magic that dominates throughout. I would be better served looking in a different mirror. I will too, in this day and age. It is unusual to say the least for a filmmaker. Not to Sanders. Snow White and the Huntsman. Kristen Stewart plays the beloved fairy tale princess but barely says a word. Almost everything you learn about the character, which admittedly isn't much, other people tell you. You constantly hear about how good and pure and innocent she is, but you never see her embody these qualities. The same goes for her beauty. That dead horse is beaten into the ground, but you're never allowed to sit back, gather information, and decide for yourself. You know the basics of the Snow White legend, and the movie never strays too far from that. There are a few detours, but nothing major. An evil queen, Ravenna, Charlize Theron, is obsessed with beauty and remaining forever young. She usurps the throne from Snow White's map. Stewart, father, imprisons the young girl, and dark times fall over the kingdom. Snow White's beauty of the throw that worried around so much it loses all meaning is the only direct competition to Ravenna's own. When the prisoner escapes, the queen hires a grizzled boohound, the Huntsman, Chris Hemsworth, to go into the dark forest, catch the fugitive, and return her to Ravenna so she can eat the young girl's still beating heart and become immortal. Storytelling in swath is the biggest weakness, and the movie is just one scene after another that never builds to anything. Swath does have some exciting visuals. The dark forest feeds on the fears of those traveling through the woods, causing hallucinations, bad trips, where branches come alive and turn into snakes, specters erupt out of trees, and sinister birds screech overhead. Even the bridge hole, who looks like an animated lump of driftwood, is impressive, but there is absolutely nothing to back that up. There is little to no characterization that doesn't come via voiceover. It goes back to that old writing adage, show don't tell. Let your characters be themselves and act according to their personalities and allow your audience to draw their own conclusions. To dump all that exposition up front is lazy writing alike when Snow White finds a random white horse just chilling on the beach at an opportune moment when she could really use a horsey, not to mention horribly unsatisfying as a viewer. Back to the acting for a moment. Sanders doesn't let Stewart say much. She has one big rally the troops moment, but that's it. How much giving her more lines would have helped is a debatable point, as when she does speak, it is always just a mumbled sentence or two. Honestly, she seems bored with the whole thing. What might have helped the movie would be to have the spend less time talking, or at least screaming. Her performance is so over-out, you can't help but laugh every time she opens her mouth. Most of her dialogue is delivered in shrieks with fiends popping, her face burning red, and her eyes welling up with tears. There is no subtlety whatsoever, and that includes the acting. It's like a leaf fist pummeling you upside the head. The most disappointing part is that you can see how SWAT could have been a cool, spooky take on the Snow White mythos. The ambiance is there. The grim, impoverished kingdom is rendered well. They could have used the dark force to great effect, but that part of the story is glossed over, and you never feel like the characters are in real danger. There's no tension. Watching Ravenna emerge from a pile of bird corpses is gross and stunning at the same time. That character in particular could have been something memorable, or at least memorable for the right reasons. Ravenna has a lifelong obsession with beauty and appearances. But at the same time, she is on a quest for revenge against every man who has ever wronged her by only paying attention to the exterior. That theme is touched on with a few early lines, then abandoned completely in favor of yelling and hanging out with her weird albino brother. If they had taken the time to develop Ravenna to let her use a quiet menace instead of a white hatroid rage, she could have been a great, creepy, wounded villain. Squandered potential is the overarching problem with Snow White and the Huntsman, and it is full of could-haves. This could have been a unique spin on a classic full of visual stunts that enhance the story. Unfortunately, that's not the case. By far, the best part of the film is the dwarves. It's an all-star cast that includes Ian McShane, Bob Hoskins, Nick Frost, Ray Winstone, Eddie Marsan, Toby Jones, Johnny Harris, and Brian Gleason. They're only in the last third of the film, but they are by far the most earnest, engaging, well-rounded characters of the bunch. When they interact, you feel their connection and honesty. The exact opposite of everything else in this movie. They say the former king's daughter, Snow White, has escaped. Bless her. You hadn't heard? It's all up and down the street. Haven't you even seen all those guards riding with swords? Clanking after being imprisoned in one of those castle towers for 10 long years. The poor dear somehow managed to slip through that evil Queen Ravena's fingers and make a run for it. She was such a pretty little thing all those years ago. A skin white as snow, hair black as ebony, lips red as blood. Who knows what she may be like now? I heard she had to run into the dark forest to escape, and my Hubert says that neither man nor beast can live long in that nasty place. Of course, there's good magic about that girl. Everyone knows. They say that witchy queen Atua on her. Isaiah sent a drunken huntsman out after the girl. And wouldn't you know it, the young thing somehow turned the big gorilla over to her way of thinking. That's magic, if you ask me. And there's even talk that a gang of dwarfs has rallied to her cause, too. Can you believe it? I only hope it's true. Goodness knows we need a little change here. Ever since that devilish Ravenna killed the king and took the throne, the whole land has gone to filth and rot. It's bad magic, I tell you. Black magic. They say this snow will heal the land. May it be so, is all I'll say. May it be so. Positive elements. When a magical golden mirror warns Ravenna that Snow White's goodness and purity could be her queenly downfall, Ravenna fights tooth and nail to somehow snatch Snow's heart and blot those good things from the land. It's the framework for a classic good versus evil battle in which Snow somehow manages to convince man, beast, and dwarf alike that they must fight for what is right and set their kingdom free. Snow's willing to risk her life for that fight. She rides alongside brave soldiers into a hail of enemy arrows, and she stands weaponless before a giant troll to keep it from killing a fallen friend. Her actions cause a dwarf to dream of being proud of his people once more. I see an end to the darkness, another one says. A third readily jumps forward to take a deadly arrow meant for her. The huntsman is filled with grief over his wife's untimely death. He talks of his undying love for the woman, and he sees a spark of who she was in Snow, prompting him to fight, without falter, to protect the girl. Spiritual elements. When we first see the adult Snow White, she picks up a pair of handmade figures representing her deceased royal parents, and prays, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done," a broken bar. The rest of the film, spiritual references bounce back and forth between a fairy mythology and Queen Ravenna's very dark craft. Before she's even born, her mother's pricked finger and drops of blood on the snow sets some of Snow White's magic in motion, leaving her destined to heal the land. A group of dwarfs state that their physical ailments have disappeared after being near her, and creatures of the forest approach her with a sort of reverence. A huge troll stops its rampage at her word, and a giant white stag revered as a creature of great import in several mythology is supposed to give her his blessing. We learn later that Ravenna's mother concocted a magical potion with 3 drops of her daughter's blood and mysteriously mirroring Snow's mother's accidental incantation. In this case, though, Ravenna drank the potion, and it gave her magical powers and control over her greatest asset, her beauty. Subsequently, Ravenna casts a number of black spells. She creates soldiers out of ebony shards. She regains youth and beauty by sucking the life force out of young girls. She transforms herself into a flock of ravens and into the shape of a young man. She telekinetically crushes a man's heart within his body. She empowers a burnished gold disc that morphs into a faceless mirror figure, and she heals wounds on her brother and herself. We hear an exclamation of gods, sexual romantic content. Queen Ravenna wears cleavage-boosting dresses. She strips off her robe and sinks into a white cream-filled pool where we see her from the waist up as she covers her breasts with her arms. After she's lost much of her beauty, becoming bony and depleted, we see her naked form again. From the back, tiny fairy creatures are seemingly naked, covered in a fine fur or hair. Ravenna's brother approaches a reclining Snow and puts his hands on her waist and shoulder in a somewhat seductive way. Snow and her childhood friend Prince William kiss. The huntsman, in his grief, kisses a deceased Snow's lips after lamenting his inability to protect her. The king begins kissing Ravenna's neck on their wedding night. Both of them dressed in nightgowns, a broken bar, violent content, a broken bar, only to discover it's war that's on her mind, not love. She talks of kings using and discarding beauty, then straddles her new husband and plunges a knife into his chest. We see a blood stain spread across the white linen that covers him. She then opens the castle gates, and her dark army swarms the fortress, butchering the king's unwary forces. It's an initial battle that features extended sequences of sword hacking and stabbing. Later, a climactic battle involves a considerable amount of hand-to-hand combat and many more bloody deaths. Magical entities impale and throw soldiers about. Arrows rain down and pierce the chest plates of the men on horseback. Burning bombs are catapulted into charging force. They explode, sending fighters sprawling. Ravenna is stabbed in the gut by an unknown attacker. She magically pulls the blade out with no apparent damage. To prove her power, she steps into a roaring fire where we see her skin begin to crisp and burn, then magically heal again. Later, though, she is vanquished by another Stubbidist, One Blood. And she dies in agony, shriveling into an ancient husk of her former self. She uses her magic to hurl man away from her. She slaps Snow round, sending the girl face first into a stone step, bloodying her mouth. She wears metal claws on her fingers that she rakes foes with. And we see her use a talent to dig into the open bloody chest of a small bird, scooping out its small heart and popping it into her mouth. A flock of ravens dies, crashing down on the floor of an open courtyard, bones snapping and broken bodies flopping. It's out of the resulting tar-like mire that Queen Ravenna's form magically reconstitutes and crawls forward. The Huntsman slashes at his oversized axe, also using it to parry their sword blows. While battling a huge troll, he runs between the creature's legs and hacks with bloody abandon at its calves. The beast responds by smacking the man into a rock, outdropping and knocking him senseless. Prince William is portrayed as a Robin Hood-like warrior who pierces many a man with his lightning-fast arrows. Snow, in full armor, kills several people with sword blows and stabs to the chest. Ravenna's brother is slammed against a fallen tree trunk where he's impaled on its broken, jagged surface. He screams in the throes of death, and miles away, Ravenna falls to the floor in agony. 2. Torment. Crude or profane language. 2 uses of H. 1 of DN drug alcohol content, numbing himself against the grief of his wife's death. The Huntsman is usually either drunk or pretty regularly drawing from a wineskin that hangs from his belt. But when he and Snow meet the dwarfs, they give him quite a run for his meat, gulping. Money, the king knocks over a chalice full of wine. Snow falls into a patch of that, sports spewing vegetation in the dark forest, and she begins to see male swirling hallucinations, including swarms of noxious insects, branches that transform into snapping snakes, and snarling man-sized creatures with bat wings. When Ravenna's brother is sprayed with these spores, his hands appear to melt. Other note for the elements Queen Ravenna lies to the Huntsman, promising to resurrect his dead wife with her magic. Several dwarfs sneak into a fortified city through the sewers, making a few toilet humor jokes about their surroundings. Conclusion. I've always liked fairy tales, whether in cartoony flicker storybook for the kids form, but it appears that those once-upon-a-time sweet and innocent versions don't often make the grade nowadays. Today's reimaginings usually have to come with a bit more buy. So in this case, an evil and vain queen is reshaped into a horribly powerful witch who magically and forcibly extracts the beauty from young girls and nibbles on the bloody hearts of small birds. A group of dwarfs is recast as a gang of hard-boiled pick-swinging mug-tippers. And a beautiful princess must, of course, be able to save herself while leading an army's charge in slaying matriarchal monsters with her own blade. If that all sounds too much like a now overly cranky indictment, let me say at this point that on a few fronts, this new approach to Snow's story works. Heightened danger offers more chance for self-sacrificial bravery, and the cinematic sweep feels much grander than it did in past renditions, with visually provocative quests sprawling their way through darkened forests, dew-kissed sparkling fairylands, and crisp icy mountaintops. But yes, it's mostly an indictment, and one that's provable enough not to be branded haphazard or merely cranky. The movie picks up elements of The Lord of the Rings and several of Jonava movies will ask Kristens to Dawn's armor and grabs a sword, and Charlize there and chews up the scenery in a hungry rage. The action, while spectacular in its presentation, is largely predictable, and there are far too many characters to keep track of, much less be charmed by. Want to introduce your youngest kiddo to a group of hungover dwarfs or roaring beasties? Want to leave them in the delusion-riddled dark forest within reach of Queen Ravena's dark spells? My first thought upon hearing of this movie was Kristen Stewart as the fairest of them all. You've got to be kidding me. But the series of remarkably intriguing trailers, sporting some spectacular effects and action, were enough to convince me that it might be worth seeing. Besides, I'm a sucker for huge swords and horses epics, a broken bar, particularly when a few scary-looking beasties get thrown in. The verdict? Mixed. The plot of Snow White and the Huntsman isn't exactly obscure. Evil Queen Raveena, Charlize Theron, wants to kill beautiful Princess Snow White, Kristen Stewart, to obtain youth. Snow promptly flees to the dark forest where she meets the huntsman Chris Hemsworth and a band of surly dwarves. Large-scale battles result. So what sets Snow White and the Huntsman apart? The answer is surprisingly multifaceted. For starters, this is a gorgeous film. I don't mean that in the Avatar or Avengers sense. Say if all its digital effects were set aside, Snow White and the Huntsman would remain a beautifully rendered cinematic vision. Everything from shot image from this movie could be enlarged and framed like a painting of broken bar. It's that good. With the addition of some appropriate, unobtrusive computer graphics, it becomes simply exquisite. I didn't expect there to be any heavy world view elements in this movie. I was pleasantly surprised, however, to discover some interesting undercurrents. Most notably, Snow's quest is cast in far more messianic terms than in the source material. At the beginning of the film, Snow recites the Lord's Prayer in its entirety, a very surprising touch. Not only is this highly anachronistic, since when do fantasy worlds refer explicitly to the real-world Bible? It doesn't seem to fit at first. Further context, however, sheds light on this inclusion. In a pivotal scene, Snow encounters the glorious White Hart, described reverently as he by the dwarves. As she touches the mythical creature, a dwarf whispers breathlessly, "She is the one." The scene is even shot in such a way that Snow appears to be standing on water. In any other fantasy film, I'd write this off as stereotypical, "She's the fulfillment of the prophecy" posturing. But the film takes this a step further. Whereas in the source material, true love's kiss is the force that resurrects Snow. In Snow White and the Huntsman, not a single mention is made of Trullo's supposedly miraculous power. Ironically, Snow is actually betrayed by a kiss at one point, though it's never explicitly stated. There's a very real sense that Snow is acting out a much larger cosmic plan of sorts, a broken bar, that this is a struggle for the ultimate victory of good, not just a squabble over magical Botox. Side note for any serious theology buffs. Early on in the movie, a much younger Snow helps heal a bird with a broken wing. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, a Gnostic text purporting to describe the childhood of Christ, contains a story in which Jesus shapes birds from clay and then commands them to fly, bringing them to life. I'm pretty sure this wasn't an intentional inclusion, but if so, broken bar. It's a very clever touch. All that being said, this semi-messianic theme remains underdeveloped throughout the third act day, and this highlights perhaps the most unfortunate problem with Snow White and the Huntsman: obvious meddling by studio executives in their efforts to make a tentpole movie that would appeal to all audiences. The top brass evidently succeeded in deleting anything contentious or innovative. The end product naturally is rather bland. The seeds of a really, really good movie are here. The first half hour is spellbinding, and I'd be surprised if the movie didn't scoop up a few awards for its gorgeous cinematography throughout. What drags it down is an abysmal script, a broken bar one that consistently refuses to go in any interesting directions. The evil queen comes closest to being a nuanced character, but there's no follow-through. In her final confrontation with the queen, Snow declares, "You can't have my heart." No, really, I had no idea. An awkward pause follows, and I hoped there would be some unique follow-up, a broken bar, some forgiveness proffered, or redemption foreshadowed, but alas, such was not to be. Note to screenwriters throwing in a tragic sympathy scene to try to humanize your villain is a cheap move. If The Silence of the Lambs featured a flashback of Hannibal Lecter being bullied in high school, would that have improved the movie? There are better ways to create a multidimensional antagonist. This in turn hamstrings the very talented actors on display. Charlize there and conjures up cold menace as the queen, but the script requires her to do lots of deranged screaming, a broken bar, which ends up sounding ludicrous. Kristen Stewart comes off as a bit of a brig, and Chris Hemsworth is obviously still stuck in Thor mode. None of this is to say that Snow White and the Huntsman is a bad movie. It's not, in fact. When stacked up against Clash of the Titans, Alice in Wonderland, and others, it's pretty good. It reminded me a lot of the Narnia films in a good way. A broken bar. There's much more C.S. Lewis than Tim Burton here. As entertainment, I enjoyed A Broken Bar, though I can't help wondering how much better it could have been. For all the hype over the dark tone of this film, it's really pretty tame in the content department. There are a few mild sexual elements and frequent outbreaks of mostly bloodless violence, but the PG-13 rating is never pushed. Given the source material, I expected some serious boundary pushing on all levels of Broken Bar, but this doesn't materialize. Is it worth watching, if not in theaters? Owners of Blu-ray players need to see this one at some point. A Broken Bar. The visuals and cinematography are breathtaking. Fans of fantasy action epics could do much worse, and there is some interesting food for thought here. In the end, Snow White and the Huntsman is a good film, but one that falls short of greatness by a maddeningly slim margin. Snow White and the Huntsman has all the elements of a good medieval fantasy movie, a richly imagined world, breathtaking CGI, a dazzlingly good-looking cast, only there's something off. It may be the soulless acting of Kristen Stewart, it may be the stilted, awkward dialogue, but it probably was that Snow White and the Huntsman tried to be the best interpretation of the classic fairy tale to ever exist, only to fall a bit short. The movie invests a lot in how it looks, spending much time on sweeping shots of the bleakly majestic countryside and slowing down the magic-filled CGI scenes as much as possible without looking too tawdry. Even the soundtrack makes an obvious effort to be as epic and grandiose as possible, and it works, at least for the first 45 minutes. The story begins simply enough, with the prelude dictating the fall of the king, Noah Huntley, Your Highness, and Snow White, Kristen Stewart, Twilight, by the hands of the beautifully vicious Ravenna, Charlize Theron, young adult. After years of imprisonment, Snow White escapes only to get lost in the dark forest, forcing Ravenna and her creepy brother Sam's brutal defiance to hire the titular huntsman Chris Hemsworth Thor to track her down. However, the huntsman instead decides to aid her in her fight against the Ravenna. Seems like a simple enough plot, right? Well, it seems the movie thought so too, and decided to spice things up with a few more subplots. Snow White and the Huntsman seems to pick up as many subplots as possible, including a magical destiny and a messy love triangle involving William Sam Claflin, Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger, Tides, a childhood friend of Snow White's, both of which are unceremoniously dropped in favor of a huge battle scene. The overabundance of subplots weigh down this film, not to mention their lack of resolution. If the subplots weren't enough, there is many a plot hole and Dex mocking a device in this movie, many of which the film does not explain, opting instead to distract us with yet another beautiful scene of CGI magic. The hallucination scenes are indeed gorgeous, though, as much fun as it is to rave about the excellent CGI, the actors aren't to be overlooked. The is magnificent albeit a bit one-note, as a vain woman driven power-mad by paranoia. She snarls and struts her way through her role, but still manages to act circles around Stewart. In fact, everyone acts circles around Stewart. The poor girl seems to have little talent for the wide-eyed vulnerability that the role seems to call for, looking instead like she's posing for magazine photo shoot in each shot. There's no denying that Stewart is beautiful, but her limited acting ability makes it hard to see Snow White as a character rather than a plot device. Whatever the oversold to Snow White and the Huntsman is compensated for by what adds up to a sweeping cinematic summer epic. It turns out that the huntsman Chris Hemsworth, a Thor, who with Snow White, Kristen Stewart at The Runaways is upstaged by the most evil stepmother. Charlize the A. Hancock, since Lady Tanina's Cinderella A is also the hunted. This, too, is a fairy tale with beautiful landscapes and fairies and magical spells. And Universal allows director Rupert Sanders to indulge in some of the darkest imagery in a mainstream female-driven movie. Enough so that this picture ought to be off limits to sensitive and young children. Blood drips, organs are ripped out, and the whole first half has a graphic male relevance of a gothic rock music video, but never so much that it takes us out of the story. Snow White and the Huntsman is very much about the story, though a narrative is lost along the way, which is to say it's a tale of a good girl, Snow White, an aristocrat, born of innocence and purity and light, saying the father, like a good Catholic Gly brace for religious themes and iconography, which are not overdone, like the God, Awful, and Nar of movies A versus her moral opposite, that plays it broad in a daring and dimensional performance that calls upon her deepest rage. Her evil queen takes man-hating to its roots, expressing an outright contempt for life that might have slipped into sadism, but isn't. The evil queen has been wronged, it is shown, and she makes everyone pay with her hatred for everything right in the world. She is the vain narcissist whose self-love merely masks her self-hatred. The ultimate proto-feminist raging against men and the puny incestuous parasite, all wrapped up in an evil bundle that kills creatures dead in an instant. She detests men for being man, including her own brother, whom she strikes down without pity, and as he gravels that he has been a loyal servant. The queen mocks him with the question, "Have you not given you all this to he from whom she has taken every trace of manliness?" When evil stepmother walks the wedding aisle with her groom to see guests adoring the little girl whose eyes look up to her in wonder, and she turns to look daggers at the child as her rival, a wicked notion thoroughly mined here. We know this woman has no ego, only vi, spreading evil wherever she treads. Beautiful Theron carries the queen's ugly smallness through the role and the picture in a perfect performance. She dominates the movie as she should. Her act of evil dispatches the Huntsman to assassinate the king's daughter as Snow White confined to solitude in a dark tower. Stewart offers a heroine who must learn to summon her inner strength and match it to her innocence. When a purposely disfigured child, marred on purpose to avoid the evil queen's wrath against the beauty, sits with Snow White to make a crude doll. Snow asks simply, "How about the face?" It's an interesting role, and Stewart is good in it, with a gruff huntsman who was burned by loss, pursuing the princess into the dark forest and making himself face his own inner demons in the process. A Snow White and the Huntsman is not as deep as all that, and there are marked flaws in plot development, places where Snow White is catapulted into situations that call for more than what we've seen, but it is a distinctive depiction of good versus evil, with a dramatization of woman, filled with rage, rebellion, and resurrection that make the action matter. Battles are epic, visuals are striking, and the dwarves look for Toby Jones among others, and another excellent turn by Ian McShane as one who resembles Tiny Tim. Described as noble gold miners, which they are, earned their way to the front lines in a revolutionary war against the evil Queen's reign of darkness, with a woman embracing her goodness leading the way. We've already known for quite some time that 2012 would bring us to incarnations of the tale of Snow White, the lighter and more humorous Mirror Mirror. In this tale, A Snow White and the Huntsman, a darker and more adventurous reimagining of the Snow White tale. When such a thing happened to the tale of fan cold-blooded Truman Capote in the form of the dueling film Sakapata, and an infamous at the first one out of the Capo A was the hands-down winner, both in terms of awards and box office. Things should be different this time around. Bully Mirror. Mirror had the Oscar CR of Julia Roberts. The simple truth is that the vast majority of America found the film less than magical and just plain lacking. The film didn't exactly tank, but $62 million in receipts as a disappointment when your film cost $85 million to make. It'll be interesting to see how audiences take to Snow White and the Huntsman. Although casting Kristen Stewart in the lead should minimally lead to decent opening weekend receipts, with her wit to fanboys and girls likely going through withdrawal right about now. This film also features solid Oscar crit in the presence of Charlize Theron, who makes one seriously badass wicked stepmother and muscle man. Chris Hemsworth is here as the Huntsman. It has been impossible to not notice that some are already picking on the casting of Stewart, whose screen image isn't exactly magical, and who at first thought seems a tad too old to take on the role of the Snow White that most who remember the fairy tale have in their mind. Let it go. Stewart may not have the stuff of Disney princesses past, but she's fine if a tad outshined by Theron's truly electric performance. This simply isn't a Disney version of the Snow White tale. Instead, this Snow White is a young woman weaving together visions of the princess with the soul of a May evil adventurer, relentlessly fighting for all that is good and right and, well, just plain fun to watch on the big screen. Stewart certainly won't be winning any awards for her performance here, but she certainly lays claim to a post will light a career in fine fashion. We've always known that Stewart could act, perhaps not with great emotional variance, but definitely with emotion and conviction. It's doubtful that her performance here will have Hollywood suddenly casting her in a series of adventure flicks, but Stewart puts on full display an energetic, inspired, and satisfying performance. But in reality, the film truly is stolen by Charlize Theron as the dark and dastardly stepmother. That Julia Roberts only hinted at in A Mirror Mirror. Julia Roberts only hinted as the idea of a truly evil stepmother, serving up a more tongue-in-cheek performance that fit the tone of her film nicely, but seemed a tad reserved and yet cartoonish. This seems to get her character completely, turning even the most ludicrously written lines into eloquent masterpieces that leave you tingling as she spews them. There's a hint of camp, but the performance itself is never campy. Instead, Theron's performance is simply a broad performance that is deliciously dark without going over the edge. Again, the simply gets it and nails the tone almost perfectly. It was a tad distracting and unnecessary for director Rupert Sanders to cast well-known Brits as the 8 dwarfs. Yes, there's initially 8 until one meets an untimely demise. Rather than casting some of Hollywood's quite table dwarf actors, instead, we get the likes of Bob Hoskins, Ian McShane, and Ray Winstone, among others. Anyone familiar with the actors will be a tad taken back, while others will simply wonder why bother. The arc of the story is familiar with Snow White, starting out as a young girl played by Raffey Cassidy, whose father is the king. When Raffey marries the king and kills him on their wedding night, Snow White is locked away in the North Tower for years until she finally escapes into the dark forest to be followed by, you guessed it, the Huntsman. First-time director, Sanders manages to create the world most of us expected a mirror Arome to create. A world simultaneously magical and frightening and completely and utterly awesome. Hemsworth gives a low-key get-it Loki performance as the Huntsman with a traumatic past. The actor proving once again that just perhaps there may be at least a hint of life beyond his muscle-bound roles. Sam Claflin is here as Snow White's potential love interest, though their sparks are even less than those between Bella and a certain werewolf. Upon first look, it seems that Snow White and the Huntsman is a movie that is simply meant to be pretty. The first thing one might notice, either from previews or posters, are the 3 stars Chris Hemsworth, Kristen Stewart, and Charlize Theron. Also, it is a film based on a fairy tale, which are known for their dazzling imagery and beautiful scenery. But it's definitely more than just a pretty face. The story of Snow White is familiar to all, but there are none quite like the story this movie tells. The evil queen, Raffey Theron, is a very powerful woman with a very wicked plan to take over every kingdom in the world. Among her many magical powers, her beauty is also a dangerous weapon, for she uses it to allure kings and take everything from them. When she takes over King Magnus' kingdom, she kills him and imprisons his daughter, Snow White. When her magical mirror informs her that Snow White is the only person capable of defeating her, as well as the only person who shall become more beautiful, she plans to kill her. Snow White escapes the kingdom, and Raffey sends a local huntsman to get her with the promise that she will bring his wife back from the dead. The Huntsman and Snow White meet in the very dangerous dark forest where strange creatures lurk, and many men have gone to die. When he discovers that Trevina lied and he will not see his wife again, he makes it his duty to protect Snow White. They travel all across the land, fleeing from the Queen's men and meeting several other colorful characters along the way. When creating a movie about a story that is so familiar across the world, it's a large task to undergo. There's the question of creating something unique while at the same time staying true to it, the story that everyone knows. When it comes to Snow White and the Huntsman, the crew did a wonderful job. Director: Rupert Sanders. The writers, cinematographer, set designers, and visual effects artists all knew exactly what they were getting, and they lived up to the task. Sanders directed the actors in a way that made their characters all likable or easily hated. The writers took the story of Snow White in a completely new direction that was innovative and interesting, though it did find Kristen Stewart in yet another love triangle. The set designers and visual effects artists were wonderful at creating scenery and creatures that were aesthetically pleasing. The cast must also be praised for their performances. Hemsworth was great as the Huntsman, who was a sympathetic yet very strong character. There was wonderfully wicked as the evil Queen Ravenna, and even Stewart, an actress known for bland performances, stepped it up. Snow White and the Huntsman was a beautiful film that captured both the dark and magical sides of fairy tales. It offered beautiful scenery and actors alike, but it was more than just a pretty face. It had action, romance, humor, and a twist that probably few have seen before. Though most of the crew are fairly unknown, they definitely stepped up to the task of creating a unique story out of something very familiar. I have high hopes for what they will create in the future. It's better than the other Snow White film this year, the campy Julia Roberts comedy, Mirror Mirror, and it's an entirely different take on the classic fairy tale. But Snow White and the Huntsman spends most of its time stuck in a lifeless sleep with no kiss being powerful enough to awake it. Snow White, Kristen Stewart, who plays a scared heroine like no other, is born, the only daughter to a king, but the evil queen played by Charlize Theron, and who is given the name Ravenna, this time around swoops in and kills him, taking his throne. You know the rest. Yada yada. Who is the fairest of them all? Yada yada, poisonous apple, and so forth. But there are plenty of new twists mixed into this telling of the tale. Chris Hemsworth is the Huntsman, who is assigned to help find Snow White once she escapes from the evil queen, but ends up falling in love with her. Because Kristen Stewart simply can't exist without being part of a love triangle, there is also William Sam Claflin, Snow White's childhood playmate, who ends up being in the mix. Which one is her Prince Charming? You should be able to guess. And despite how the movie is being promoted, there is most definitely 7 dwarves that turn up ... Actually 8 to be exact. Snow White and the Huntsman is perhaps the most gritty and realistic version ever put on screen, and carries with this realism some deeply religious undertone. Snow White says in Our Father, and she carries herself almost with a Jesus-like voice. The dwarves could be substituted with apostles, and her deep sleep portion of the legend is treated much more like the death and resurrection, not sincere October baby. Has there been a more blatant Christian message on screen? And there's nothing wrong with that, but the real-world religion pulls us right out of this fantasy realm. But there must have been a great vision for this film, resulting in fantastical visual splendor. There are great effects, great makeup, and well-known actors such as Bob Hoskins, Ian McShane, Nick Foster, and Ray Winstone are reduced to pine-sized dwarves without a glitch. There is death and destruction everywhere. Not an expected result going nigh into a Snow White film. Yes, some folks even die along the way. Remember when I mentioned that 8 dwarf? If only the visuals had been matched with some other important elements. The script is about as bland as you can get, and there is something that just drags. The evil queen in this film keeps her youth by sucking the life out of others, but somewhere along the way, she must have sucked every last drop of life from the story. Charlize Theron is pretty imposing as Roanna, and it's all in her eyes. Yet, her motivations as a character make little sense. There is much that makes little to no sense at all, as if we are just supposed to munch our popcorn and be entertained without noticing the inconsistencies and implausibility of what we are seeing. We did pay to see a film about Snow White. After all, what's all this bickering about plot and story? Beautiful as Kristen Stewart is, it's time to move out of Bella territory and into a role that doesn't require others to save her. Even as she dons armor and rides into battle during the film's climactic scene, it isn't really earned. Would it surprise you to learn that Kristen Stewart makes an unconvincing military leader? The fact that I can even start a review of Snow White and the Huntsman that way cements the film's status as one of the summer's more peculiar. Would be, stylistically, the film pushes no particularly eccentric boundaries, but one can imagine easier sells to mainstream audiences than a violent, mildly grotesque epic with Snow White in the title. At least, Snow White and the Huntsman manages to be one of the few major summer films whose creative origin is too old to be owned by a movie studio or comic book publisher. The movie is actually made as if storytelling were a higher priority than selling toys or appeasing fanboys, a feat in of itself for something that costs nearly $200 million. Still, there's a cool era to the proceedings, as if the filmmakers were cautious about making something too interesting or hitting a nerve with the audience. Stewart plays the anonymous princess in her first outing as a non-Twilight major film star. As for sword swinging, I could think of more threatening opponents than one that barely outweighs the weapon they wield. But despite Stewart's failings as a combatant, she does have the delicately feminine look required to pull off a beauty contest where fairness is the primary concern. Though don't expect her to exude the warmth of a first-rate princess, even given the benefit of the doubt, Stewart is not leading lady material of the sort that this role needs. Her main asset here is the Rorschach quality that allows her female fans to look at her and envision themselves in the arms of a handsome vampire whatever. Snow White's tormentor is Queen Ravenna, played by Charlize Theron, who most would argue is effortlessly fairer than her opponent. The Queen, who reigns over a desolate kingdom and feasts on the bodies of others to sustain her beauty, is told by her magic mirror, which as Roger Robert points out, resembles the T-1000, that Snow White will either make her immortal or destroy her altogether. Thus, she sends the huntsman Chris Hemsworth out to fetch Snow White from the monster-infested dark forest, apparently with little concern that this surly. Guess what happens? First-time director Rupert Sanders keeps the pacing brisk, perhaps too much so because despite ample opportunities for a drama or romance, the plot skips along, paying little mind to character development that could raise the stakes to the level necessary to create genuine anticipation of the outcome. The most striking moment occurs when Snow White enters a magical forest filled with enchanted animals, a setting that brilliantly contrasts with the gloomy ruin brought to the rest of the movie's world by the Queen. At other times, we get delicious glimpses of darkness hinting at the macabre, such as the eerily close relationship the Queen has with her brother Sam's Brule, or a shot depicting bodies littered around the Queen's chamber after she has drained them of life essence. These elements could have been explored further without breaking the PG-13 rating, but the film's course is ultimately a safe one. Hemsworth, who proved in Thor to be a capable actor in roles requiring both dramatic and physical virtues, lends considerable gravitas to his character, a peerless warrior mourning his murdered wife. He overpowers Stewart as the presence to watch. Though since most of their interactions skew more towards plot than character development, he ends up underutilized. Snow White's dwarves, played by great English actors such as Bob Hoskins, Ian McShane, and Toby Jones, are similarly fascinating presences that are also assigned little of significance to do. Sanders, along with writers Evan Doherty, John Lee Hancock, and Hossamini, packs the film with battle scenes all nicely done, though lacking the visceral impact and rating would have allowed. Like the rest of the film, these sequences are well made, but devoid of the blood and passion that could have made them great. I yearn for a greater look into the Queen's Toad practices, the Huntsman's wounded soul, and the spectacular enchanted forest. These flourishes suggest a potentially wondrous film inside this merely adequate summer blockbuster. I'm not sure this counts as a spoiler of anything other than Universal's sleek and seductive via marketing campaign A, which has properly emphasized crows, swords, and cherries the hairy. But there are actually some dwarfs in the new movie Snow White and the Huntsman. The small fellows who befriend the exiled princess here are nothing like the grumpy, sneezy, dopey guys you remember from the Disney version. The actors who play them, including Ian McShane, Eddie Marsan, Ray Winston, and the great Bob Hoskins, all digitally shrunken, might otherwise have been assembled for a nasty little Cockney gangster film. These dwarfs are industrious, but they don't whistle while they work. Their most memorable song is a haunting dirge performed at the funeral P of a fallen comrade. So take note, there is nothing cute about this movie, and that feels right. There is something exciting about how seriously Snow White and the Huntsman takes its themes. Most of the fairy tales that have become fixtures of modern popular culture, including those like Snow White, published by the brothers Grimm in the early 19th century, emerged from the dark, violent folk landscape of early modern Europe. They are fables of innocence, but also of terror, dense with superstition and sexual anxiety. Walt Disney's justly beloved 1937 animated feature, though it has some spooky gothic visual touches, expelled most of the demons and turned the heroine into an emblem of chaste and cheerful domestic normalcy. Since then, Hollywood fairy tales have mainly tacked between wide-eyed romanticism and winking self-consciousness. Snow White and the Huntsman, directed by the first-timer Rupert Sanders from a script by Evan Dirty, John Lee Hancock, and Hosseini, tries something new, or maybe something old, even out of Vistic. Though it is an ambitious, at times mesmerizing application of the latest cinematic technology. The movie tries to recapture some of the menace of the stories that used to be told to scare children rather than console them. Its mythic medieval landscapes are heavily shadowed and austere, and its flights of magic are summoned from a zone of barely suppressed rage and dangerous power. Image Kristen Stewart as Snow White. Credit ... Universal Pictures. Most of the power and nearly all of the rage belong to Ravenna, Miss Theron's golden-haired, furious queen, having murdered the king on their wedding night and imprisoned his daughter in a tower. Ravenna pines in front of her liquid metal mirror, plucks the hearts out of birds with metal fingernail extensions, apparently designed for that purpose, and terrorizes her subjects. She is loyally attended by her creepy brother Finn. Sam's Brule, a kind of Dorian Gay portrait of his flawless sister, the ugliness of whose soul seems inscribed on his leering, pitted face, but otherwise alone in the castle of her cruelty. And some information about it. How do you like our today's video? Please let us know by commenting, and if you like this video, please like it, share it, and forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.